When you go to a whiskey tasting, you're very often asked, do you smell apples? Do you smell lychee, apricot? Do you smell cinnamon, spices? Do you smell vanilla? What do you think all these smells, these flavor profiles are coming from? They are actually coming from the process of whiskey making. So let us today demystify this whole where is the vanilla coming from and the spices coming from and the apricots coming from by way of getting into the whiskey making process. I am going to base this on Rampur Single Malt whiskies. We are also going to taste these whiskies and understand how are these whiskies made and how do they influence the taste, the aroma, the flavor profile of the product. So let's simplify the process first. How is whiskey made? It's made with grains to which hot water is added, to which some yeast is added. The yeast converts the sugars into alcohol and you get some sort of a beer, and that beer is then distilled, which gives you a harder spirit, which is whiskey. Now, let's break this down into processes. The first process is malting. Since we are talking about Rampur, Rampur is a single malt. Now, whiskey can be made with any grains, but single malts have to be made with only malted barley. So the first thing is barley. Where does the barley come from when it comes to Rampur? Rampur's barley comes from the northwestern state of Rajasthan. What kind of barley do we use? There are two kinds of barleys which are used for alcoholic beverages, which are the 2-row barley and the 6-row barley. How the grains are arranged along the shaft, that is the 2-row or the 6-row. In case of Rampur, it is 6-row barley, which means that it has higher protein content and higher fiber content, which attributes to its sweetness. So there you go. From the first thing, which is the raw material, an attribute of Rampur, the sweetness which you taste in Rampur, part of it comes from the 6-row barley that we use. Now, barley cannot just be used for making whiskey. You have to malt it. Malting is a process of germination. Germination is like just, how we were kids, we used to take a seed and wait for the plant to grow. The same process, we take barley, we steep it in water, and then we let it germinate a bit little. But then you have to stop the germination, otherwise it will become a barley plant. Stopping of germination is done by kilning or roasting the barley. How do you roast it? By just putting it in a furnace. Now, in Scotland, you use peat as the fuel for this skin. Peat is a product which is like a soft coal, the coal which has not yet developed. It still has some vegetativeness in it. So when you use peat to burn the furnaces, that smoke, the smokiness goes into the husk of the barley, and that is responsible for a peaty whiskey. So can you imagine this peaty whiskey thing starts right in the beginning in the malting process. In Rampur, we do not use any peat, hence our whiskies are not peated. So the next process is mashing. Mashing means you take the grist, the barley powder, the malted barley powder rather, and then you put some hot water and add yeast. Now the yeast is going to do the whole reaction where the sugars in the malted barley are going to convert into some alcohol, some carbon dioxide, and some other compounds. These other compounds are very, very important. Chemically, they're a very small part of the game. But in our whiskey making process, these small chemical compounds, which are normally esters, you might have studied in your chemistry in 8th or 9th grade about esters. These esters are fruity aromatic compounds which are also produced when fermentation happens. Now let me give you two examples. Apples have an ester which is called ester pentanoid, which gives it its flavor. Similarly, cinnamon has ester cinnamate, which is a compound which is in cinnamon, which gives its flavor. Believe me or not, in certain distillations, ester cinnamate and ester pentanoid are produced Doesn't mean that we have cinnamon or apple in that liquid, but we do have those esters, those compounds, which actually are responsible for the flavoring of a natural apple or a natural cinnamon. That is how you start tasting this fruits and spices in your whiskey. So in case of Rampur, a lot of people tell me that they taste lychee and apricot and tropical fruit. These are these compounds which are being produced, which give it that character. Now, what's the next step? The next step is, of course, distillation, which is going to change this beer into our whiskey. When fermentation happens, the liquid which you get is just 5 to 10% alcohol, but that's not what you want. You want 40% alcohol. So you are going to distill it. What is distillation? Distillation means you heat a product which has alcohol and water, of course, which is this beer, which is called wort. Now you heat this and the alcohol separates, because alcohol evaporates at 78.4 degrees Celsius. So alcohol separates, the remaining is the water. You distill it twice, and when you distill it, you finally get a product which is about 60% alcohol. Yes, I know the whiskey is about 40-45%, but you actually get it at 60, and then you water it down in the next step. So the distillation is done in copper pot stills. In case of Rampur, it is also distilled twice in our distilleries in Rampur in Uttar Pradesh. The next and one of the most important processes about whiskey making is maturation. A lot about maturation is something which the marketing people use, age of the bottles and what casks are used, how is it matured. This really gives the most taste and the most character to a whiskey. Now, let's talk about Rampur. Rampur is just made in the very Scotch way, although it's made in India. So in Scotland, they use the barrels from America. They used old bourbon casks. Now, bourbon in America is matured in new casks. But then bourbon is only aged for that long. So for every bourbon, a new cask has to be used. So there is so many used casks, right? What do you do with them? They started exporting them to Scotland, and the Scots started using them to mature their whiskey. That's how the whole system of used American oak barrels started in the world. So Rampur also does the same. We use ex-American bourbon casks to mature our whiskey. Now, what happens in these casks? Now, when these casks are made, right, they are made with oak. Now, they are like this, concave. How do you think they are bent? The wood is toasted and heated so that it becomes malleable for us to make the cask. Actually, the process is called toasting the wood. We toast the wood for us to make those casks. In that process, there is a chemical called lignin in wood, which converts into vanillin. Vanillin is the same compound which gives vanilla essence its flavor. Then when you age the whiskey in those barrels, that flavor gets imparted to the liquid. Pretty much every whiskey in the world would smell a little bit of vanilla. And even Rampur smells a little bit of vanilla like any other whiskey, because we do use these oak casks. The bourbon casks also impart a little bit of butterscotchiness and some sweetness to the product. So some sweetness is coming from the 6-row barley, as we discussed. Some sweetness is coming from these barrels. We never added sugar to the whiskey for it to be that sweet. Everything is related to a process. Now, there is another trend in the world that we are now maturing or finishing, I would say, our single malts in other casks which had other inhabitants before, like sherry casks. So sherries are being produced in Spain. It's an aromatized wine. But sherries are not that popular anymore. But sherry cask finished single malts are hugely popular. Now, these sherry butts, as they call them, sherry casks are very big casks. They are called butts. They are sent to Scotland or other countries wherever single malt is produced, even to India, and whiskies are then finished in those casks. So whiskies also absorb a little bit of the characteristics of the sherry, because there is some sherry still in that wood. A few liters, I would say, in every butt would be there entrapped in the wood. That also imparts flavor. Maturation is generally done for about 3 years by law, minimum of 3 years, but most single malts are aged for far more in Scotland. Now in India, maturing single malts is a very tricky process because of the weather. We get 4 seasons, maybe 5 seasons, and a lot of contractions occur, and the angels share a part of the whiskey which gets evaporated through the casks. They are kind of porous, the air can evaporate. That is really high. So the whole chemical reaction which takes place between the wood and the liquid is kind of faster, right? In a country like India where the climate is so different. The maturation in northern India is like 3-4 times faster than Scotland. But still, Rampur whiskies are aged for a very long time. Okay, now coming to the last step, which is marrying. A lot of casks are then put into a big vat, and all these casks are then mingled and let them marry each other, and a little bit of color can be added according to Scotch laws. They can be single malt laws. A little bit of color is added so that we get a consistent product. A little bit of water is added to adjust the alcohol content from the 60%. That is, the strength of the whiskey when it was distilled. It is brought down to 45%, and then a basic filtration takes place. In case of Rampur, we do not do chill filtration. That's why you see the words non-chill filtered on our bottles. We do a basic filtration, but chill filtration is just to make your whiskey really clear for aesthetic purposes. But in case of Rampur, I think we are very organic that way. We do not use chill filtration method because we do lose some compounds which impart a lot of character to the whiskey when you do use chill filtration method. Hence, our whiskey is non-chill filtered, so when you add a little bit of water to the whiskey, Rampur will get a little cloudy. So that's a good thing. So let's now taste Rampur, and now we are going to visit everything what we discussed and relate to the tasting notes. The first expression which I am going to taste today is Rampur Double Cask. This whiskey spends 2/3 of its life in American oak and 1/3 of its life in used sherry casks from Spain. What kind of sherry? Oloroso sherry from Spain. Those butts are then used to, finish the maturation process. So the first thing is color. Color is completely amber, 45% alcohol. So it's kind of, medium to high alcoholic whiskey. It's going down nice and smooth, but slowly. When it comes to smelling the whiskey, put your nose deep into the glass. I smell from one nostril to another. That's the right way of smelling. What do I smell? I smell some tropical fruit. Straight on lychee, apricot. So of course, lychees and apricots were not added into this whiskey. These are the esters and compounds which were produced in the process of fermentation. Sweetness, of course, that will be something which you taste, you don't smell, but that comes from the 6-row barley. A lot of whiskey can be appreciated through your nose. I think it's more of the nose than the taste. Let me take a sip. Got to chew, swirl the whiskey. We also know that it was finished in Oloroso sherry casks. Now those Oloroso sherry casks, what characteristics do you think they impart? Of course, a honeyed, pronounced sweetness. I taste a little bit of spice. The spice is coming from the wood. The vanilla, no marks for guessing that. I told you before, most whiskeys taste of vanilla because of the vanillin which is there in the wood. The whole mouthfeel is kinda medium to heavy and has a lingering aftertaste of, again, tropical fruit, a little bit of honey and a hint of spice. I think Double Cask has really hit the nail for a very versatile kind of a whiskey. This is here to please every kind of a palate. Let's go to the second and the latest expression of Rampur, which is the Rampur Asava. Now, Asava is a Sanskrit word which means the Indian wine. This whiskey has definitely made history because this is the first single malt in the world which has been finished in an Indian Cabernet Sauvignon barrel or a cask. So, of course, the journey starts in the ex-American bourbon barrels, the oak barrels, and then the finishing happens for a few months in Indian Cabernet Sauvignon. A lot of people ask me, do you really taste wine in this whiskey? Well, let us taste and then decipher what I taste. The first things first, look at the difference in the color. Let me put it sideways. You can clearly see that Rampur Double Cask is more brown and amber, and Rampur Asava is more reddish in color. It means that something with wine has happened. Of course, when you're going to spend a few months in ex-Cabernet Sauvignon cask, you are going to get some of the color, and that's clearly visible. And let's do a pour. I've already mentioned about the color. Now again, the legs similar, 45% strength. It's rather slow. There is something about the wine notes which I'm getting. Now, what are the notes of a Cabernet Sauvignon? Think of fruit, dark fruit, plums and prunes, dark red cherry. Something similar to what I tasted in Double Cask is the little spiciness which is coming from the wood. I think this is slightly more fruity as well, because of the Cabernet Sauvignon characteristic. Let's taste it. Slightly lighter in the mouthfeel than Double Cask, but that's just me. More rounded, but lighter. Definitely has a character. It's not an average whiskey. As I said about Double Cask is a very versatile whiskey. This is going towards one tangent, which is the dark fruit angle and the characteristics of a red wine, to be honest. So people who are wine aficionados but don't really care for single malts, guys, this is for you. So here we are. This was a tasting of Rampur Single Malts and explaining you the process of whiskey making and how every step adds to the flavor of a single malt. Let's talk a little bit about Rampur and the company behind it, which is Radico Khaitan. Rampur is one of the 3 single malts which are being produced from India, and I think it is definitely top of its game. Their USP is their Indian character, right from the sourcing of their barley to the Indian water to the Indian climatic conditions in which the whiskies are matured, so on and so forth. And of course, the whole branding and the whole royal component in the branding. Rampur is a princely state which is in north of India. And the Maharajas are used to luxury and so on and so forth. Radico Khaitan is a very old company established in 1943 and has been producing alcohol since then. They were producing industrial alcohol to start with, then they started producing other whiskeys and rums and have a huge portfolio till they finally realized the potential of the Indian single malt, as India is the largest consumer of single malts in the world, but somehow did not produce single malts. Radico Khaitan definitely cashed in at the right time, and they have produced some superlative Indian single malts. Indian single malts are here to stay. I always talk about the Japanese movement. 20 years ago, people did not know much about Japanese whiskey, and look today what's happening in the market. And I see the same road ahead for Indian single malts, and especially the house of Rampur.